Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Devar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. This is Demai, Chapter 1, Halacha 1. In the art scroll, we're on page 2A1. So yesterday we were getting into a big question. Why is this Mishnah in Demai? That's really the sub-theme of this question between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. And Rabbi Yochanan is basically taking the position that this is here because these products are going to be Hefker, and Hefker is going to be exempt from tithes. And so we're starting off, according to Rabbi Yochanan, with a discussion of what's going to be outside of the laws of Demai because it is Hefker. It is in the wilderness. It is readily available. It is considered to be such low value, and it's just there for everybody to take, and it's not in a protected courtyard. Rish Lakish has a different idea. He's saying, no, this is really trying to teach us something about Demai, which is why it's in Masechet Demai. And the idea that Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is saying, look, if you have protected fruit of these species, then he's saying that the Am Haaretz values this, and he's going to hold out the tithes. He's not going to do the tithes because he put forth the trouble and the effort to go and build out a courtyard to protect this and to grow it, and maybe he made a little bit of an orchard for some of these trees, or so they're collected in an area, and there's some effort going on there. So he's going to value it. But ordinarily, this is going to be, according to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, something that if you picked it out in the wild would be where it's so cheap and so irrelevant that he's saying the Am Haaretz would still do the tithes because as a monetary amount, it's really trivial. So there's going to come up now in the Gemara on page 2A1 in the art scroll, this position by Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish in terms of practicality about the difference between this dispute. And that's where we're going to today. So the Gemara says, come and see in which case do Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish disagree. And it says, if the majority of the growers in the area protect the lenient species, this is going to be the types of species that we're talking about in the Mishnah, all agree that the fruits are subject to the tithing obligation, whether they are Demai or definite tevel. So this sugya is saying both Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan would agree that in an area where most of the growers in this area are going to protect these species because they're going to be considered to be valuable, they're going to require the tithing. And Rabbi Yochanan's reason for an exemption would not apply. Why? Because there's no Hefker. The majority is valuing it, and they wouldn't consider it to be Hefker. So we could assume that a fruit of an unknown status is going to come from Hefker. But Rish Lakish has a different idea. He's going to say that that this doesn't come from Hefker. And he's going to say that if most of the farmers are going to be protecting the species, we're going to suspect that the area for the Am Haaretzim are valuing it so much, they're not going to be willing to tithe it. And so that really gets into the debate. Again, Rabbi Yochanan is basically giving an exemption in this case where they're going to value it and not apply it in the case where they're going to value it, because he's going to say that the majority of people are not considering it to be Hefker, and we're assuming that the fruit that is in an unknown area would come from Hefker. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. It continues, and it says, all agree that the fruits are subject to the tithing obligation, whether they are Demai or definite tevel. And I want to point out something about why you need to make these tithes. So you can't eat tevel. Okay, Torah says you can't eat tevel. Very serious to eat tevel. You get a punishment from death from heaven, which is very serious. Either you can have a very serious punishment in the world to come, you can die at a very early age, or you can have children who, God forbid, die. It's very serious, and you don't mess around with this stuff. Well, one of the ideas about definite tevel or demai is that if they separated out the truma gedola, but they did not separate out the Meiser Rishon, and then from the Meiser Rishon, they did not separate out the next tithe that they give to the Kohanim, the Trumas Meiser of Demai, then the problem is that Meiser Rishon is going to be tevel. And so that's why it's so serious for Torah scholars to go and separate out tithes. So especially even for Demai, because you can end up where it could be suffix tevel, and suffix tevel we're going to rule stringently on. Why? Because you have a death from heaven penalty if you're wrong. So if it might not have been tithed right, and you might have a real problem. So the Gemara is going to continue. It's going to say, conversely, if the majority of growers in the area do not protect these species but leave it as Hefker, all agree that they are exempt from tithing, whether they are Demai or definite tevel. And if you will suspect that the dispute was stated regarding a case where half of the growers protect these species and half do not protect them but leave them to Hefker, you cannot justify that explanation, because we learned in the Mishnah concerning fruit that is subject to an equally balanced doubt. This, by the way, is from Machshirin 210, and by the way, the Vilna Goan understands the proof of this being from a Bryce and not from the Mishnah, but that's just an aside. So over here, we're talking about an equally balanced doubt where it's going to be half-half. And the Gemara continues, says, if the doubt is half-half, both sides carry equal weight. So if you have fruit that's unknown, the status is unknown, that is going to be considered to be Demai. And what's this Mishnah teaching in Machshirin? It's teaching that where a doubt arises in the context of Demai here, since we're in the Masechet of Demai, if both sides are equal in doubt, we adopt the stringent opinion, where it's going to be 50-50. And we require the produce to be tithed. So in such a case, it would be where that's not going to be subject to dispute between Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. The question is, if you have this produce that is in a protected area and the farmers in this area protect it, you can assume that this is going to come from the protected area, and you can assume that they're not going to be tithing it, and that you have to take out tithes. That's going to be the opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Now, in terms of Rabbi Yochanan would look at this and say, well, yeah, that's fine, but maybe this still has an unknown status, and maybe this is still coming from Hefker, because generally speaking, this is going to be, considered to be such low quality produce that, it's going to be, generally a lot of growers, in total are going to abandon these species, and because they're abandoning these species, they're going to exempt it from tithing. I want to point out something. In the world, we have, economics, and, there's a cost to tying up your land as a farmer and planting very, very low quality fruit or low quality trees that don't produce a lot, or produce something that really economically doesn't have a lot of value in the marketplace. You have a very high cost for that. I mean, you have your labor, you have your water resources, and you have your land resources and your time. And you could have taken that same land resource and gone and plant something way more productive, like figs or dates or olives, something that would command a much higher price than these lower quality fruits. So the idea is that, in an area where it's going to be protected, Rabbi Yochanan would agree with Rish Lakish that, if you have this area where most of the growers are protecting these particular low quality species, that it would still require tithing, but the question is going to be for Rabbi Yochanan if this fruit is coming from this area where you're not sure if it came from this protected area or not. In other words, how do you know it came from this field? I think that's what Rabbi Yochanan would say. In other words, it's so unlikely that there's only even if you have a couple of guys growing this in this area, you only have a few of these guys who are crazy enough to allocate land over to such low value produce. So he would say that even still, maybe this produce came from the wild still because, why would you tie up your valuable resources and time and water resources and land for something that will never command a lot of money in the marketplace, in the shuk? So let's get into this question. The Gemara is going to answer by distinguishing between a case that's talked about in this Mishnah in Makshirin and in this Mishnah, and where Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagree. Rabbi Zera was saying in the final analysis that the preceding Mishnah, which we're talking about from Makshirin 2:10, where it's going to talk about if you have produce that's in doubt with equal weight, half-half, it's going to say that the Mishnah does not refer to species in which the sages were lenient regarding Demai. Rather, they are referring to actual Demai itself. So in Makshirin 2:10, it's talking about ordinary species of produce. It's going to be like olives. It's going to be like your grain, higher quality things like good quality figs. These are going to be subject to the laws of Demai. And the Mishnah is trying to teach that produce subject to this half-half doubt has to be tithed as Demai. And this is going to be with an ordinary species that people generally cultivate and they generally protect it. But for these lenient sort of oddball species that we're talking about in this Mishnah, Rabbi Zera is pointing out they're going to be treated leniently even in the case of a half-half doubt and even in a case where it could be protected. Why? Because Rabbi Yochanan is saying that if you have fruit that's this odd fruit, right, that's in an area where you have a half-half doubt that exists, then even if it's going to be definite tevel, it's going to be exempt from tithing. And Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish is going to be holding that only Demai is exempt. So the dispute is going to be in a place where you still have a half doubt. So that again, you're living in a place where there's enough people who would grow and protect these odd species, okay? And it's odd because you can go out into the Jerusalem forest and go collect as much of it as you want out there. It's not like hard to find, it's not hard to get, it's all right there. And it's generally like lower quality anyway. So the reason you're having this half doubt is in a place where it would be protected, okay? Because you might also have, it coming from just readily available produce growing in the Jerusalem forest. I was walking to the yeshiva yesterday, and there's a small dirt area, and I was looking at all the wild fennel growing there. I mean, it's all over the place here. And so why would you go build a protected courtyard? You could just walk outside and go pick fennel. So, that really brings up a question of this like half doubt. And, because this fennel might have come from a protected courtyard back in this time, but it also might have come from just a guy going out and foraging and just walking outside and picking it up. And so you're not sure which it is. Now, the Mishnah that we were covering in Makshirin 2:10, this is talking about definite species, okay? Olives are definitely going to be something that somebody protected and they worked on and things like that. And that's definitely going to be subject to Demai. But this is going to be something that, is going to be where you're not really sure in this area where they're cultivating it, where it was protected or not. Now, Rabbi Yochanan would agree and say, look, if I knew that these juju berries came from this farm right here, and this guy, this crazy guy went and protected a whole farm full of juju berries, yeah, you need to separate out Demai. fine. And he would agree with that. But he would also say, but wait a second, but if you're in a place where nobody's protecting this, then it's Hefker, and it's not subject to Demai. And Rabbi Yochanan's case comes up and says, but wait a second, but what if you're in a place where you have a few of these guys growing juju berries, and you get some juju berries, maybe it came from a Hefker source, or maybe it came from this actual farm. And again, that's how you're getting into this half-half question, according to Rabbi Yochanan. The Gemara is going to conclude the discussion of the dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish by talking about a practical application of this opinion. And the Gemara says it was taught if one entered a town and it is inhabited by a majority of non-Jews, and he buys a certain type of produce there, and he's in doubt whether the majority of the growers in this town protect this particular species, or the majority of the growers do not protect it, and they leave this species as Hefker, basically that's going to be both Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, are going to agree that the purchased produce is exempt from tithing, whether it is Demai or definite tevel. So again, you walk into a non-Jewish area, and the majority, you have 10 non-Jewish farmers, you have 2 Jewish farmers, and you buy even not this questionable produce. You buy regular produce, figs, right? Well, this is going to be like if you have a butcher shop and you have 10 butcher shops and you find meat, that's going to be there. The question is going to be if it's the majority Jewish, it's going to be subject to tithes, and in this case of the butcher shop, it would be kosher. And if it is majority non-Jews, it is going to be where likely it was grown by non-Jews, and because if non-Jews are growing something, there's no tithes to their produce. It's not subject to tithes. Same too if you have the majority of butcher shops and one carton of meat's there, and you're not sure if it's going to be kosher or not. If the majority of the butcher shops right there on that street is non-Jewish owned, it's not going to be kosher. You can't use it. So the opposite case is going to be brought up. It's going to say if one enters a town and it's inhabited by a majority of Jews and he buys a certain type of produce there, and he is in doubt whether the majority of the growers are going to protect this species or the majority of the growers do not protect this species and leave it as Hefker, everyone agrees that the produce is subject to the tithing obligation, whether it is Demai or definite tevel. Why? Because let's say even they're going to the fennel, right? Let's take this oddball species fennel. And let's say you have the custom now where it's majority owned and they're taking this oddball species and they're protecting it. So if the majority of the growers are protecting it and they're Jewish being that it's now subject to tithes, the answer is that you are going to subject it to tithes, and you're going to have to do the tithes, whether it's going to be Demai or actual tevel. You have to take out the tithes. So there's 2 things that are introduced. One is going to be if the majority or minority is going to be Jewish or not Jewish, and if the majority of minority is going to be protecting this or not. So this argument gets advanced over and walks it forward with adding this new twist to it, where what if it's grown by a majority of non-Jews or majority of Jews? Now, in the case where Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagree, the Gemara is going to say, if there's a doubt as to whether the town is inhabited by a majority of non-Jews or a majority of Jews, and there is also a doubt as to whether the majority of the growers will protect this species or the majority do not protect it, and they leave this as Hefker, the law is contingent on this dispute between Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish. Now, in the case, I want to just point out something from the Vilna Goan. In the case where there are 2 reasons for leniency, perhaps the produce came from a field of non-Jews, so the tithing is going to be at most rabbinic. Now, if it comes from a field of Jews, perhaps the majority of the growers in this town are going to protect this species. And If they're not going to protect this species, then perhaps it's just going to be treated as Hefker. And because you have this doubt that comes along, and it's not clearly involving a biblical obligation, it's going to be analogous to this half-half doubt question, where it's 50-50 doubt. And this is where Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish disagree. Rabbi Yochanan is saying that one may be lenient with regards to Tevel, whereas Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish says one may be lenient only with regard to Demai. Now, we're going to get into the next part of the Mishnah. We're going to talk about shisin. Now, shisin are a species of wild figs, and the Pnei Moshe says something that I've observed going through the Jerusalem forest and also in cultivated fig trees as well. He's saying that they're going to be the figs that grow beneath the leaves, and they are going to grow along the stems. And in most species of the figs, or it's going to grow above the leaves. Pnei Moshe is saying the shisin figs are going to be inferior quality. These are going to be figs that are growing below the leaves. So it might be that this is a particular species that has a lot of them below the leaf. It also might be that you might have some shisin figs that are also growing beneath the leaf on a cultivated tree. What do you do with this kind of fig? Because again, it'll be like one or two figs growing out of the branch, and the majority of the cluster will be above the leaf. Nonetheless, this lower quality fig is still edible. What do you do with it? Now, the Gemara is going to talk about shisin. Rabbi Shimon, the son of Rabbi Avi, says, because the Mishnah says, what are shisin? Or the Gemara says, what are shisin in talking about the Mishnah? It says, these are figs that emerge from under the leaves. And the Gemara quotes a brisa that mention other fruits that are exempt from tithing. And the early ripening figs and the late ripening figs are exempt from tithing. And which are the early ripening figs? Those that ripen before the farmer installs watchmen, shomrim, watchmen, to guard the produce. And these figs are going to be considered Hefker. And there was a famous story about Rabbi Tarfon going to collect some figs, these Hefker figs that are ripening before the farmer values this enough to install watchmen. It happened to be with Rabbi Tarfon's farm that it was Rabbi Tarfon's farm, and they were Hefker, but he also had possession of the trees and was hiring the watchmen. Anyway, there's two things happening here. One is you're going to have these figs that emerge under the cluster of leaves. These are going to be along the branches. And so these emerge under the leaves. And you also have early ripening figs and also a couple of late ripening figs that come after the farmer puts in a watchman. And this is going to be the siman of when the value is turned on. And before that point, it's going to be considered Hefker. So even the shisin, which is going to be growing beneath the leaves, this is also going to be considered Hefker. Why? It's a low quality fig. And also, you don't get a lot of them. There's only a few of them growing below the leaves on the branches when it does happen. So the Gemara interrupts this to ask a question. It says, is this matter dependent on the appointment of the watchman? In other words, you have the owner, and he did not actually declare the figs Hefker. So, why shouldn't they be subject to tithing, even if he didn't hire somebody yet to guard it? Why would it be Hefker at this point? Now, the Gemara is going to answer. Rabbi Yossi says the brisa means that the figs that are exempt, and when it amounts to the early figs, it is not enough quantity to require the care of a watchman. In other words, these are just going to be a couple of figs, and anyway, they're going to be very, very low quality, and anyway, it's not a lot. And so it's going to be considered Hefker. because the status is going to be where there's a few of them and they're very low quality. Again, also the shisin is going to be the same. There's only a couple of them growing on a branch. They're very, very low quality. You can see the difference between the figs below the branch and above the branch when you walk around the Jerusalem forest and you look at the fig trees. So the Gemara is going to continue, and it's going to talk about the other case about the late ripening figs. And so in the early ripening figs, Rabbi Yossi says that you don't really have enough quantity to warrant the care of a watchman. And what about the late ripening figs? These are going to be, says the Gemara, those that ripen after the harvesters have folded their knives. In other words, they've put away their knives to store them for the work of the next season. So once these harvesters, they put away their knives, any unripened fruit that remains on the tree is going to be disregarded by the owner and is going to be abandoned to Hefker. In other words, he basically put a siman showing he's done guarding it and watching it, and they put away their tools for harvest. They've abandoned it. So you have in Maseket Peah similar things like when you have shchichacha, and you do have shchichacha for trees. And one of the laws for shchichacha of trees is when they go past the tree. They've harvested the tree, and then they've abandoned whatever is left, and they've moved on, and it is going to be Hefker, and it is abandoned to the poor. This is covered in the chapter in shchichacha in Maseket Peah. So you have a dissenting view about figs that ripen early. And Rabbi Eli says in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, the early ripening figs are subject to the tithing obligation because they are presumed to be protected for harvesting together with a regular crop. So Rabbi Eliezer is basically saying, wait a second, the late harvesting one, we don't have a problem with that. We have that in Mishnahs. We have that where, okay, the person has basically abandoned it. He's basically gone and put away his harvesting tools. But why is it that the early ripening figs would not also be subject to tithing? Because when the harvesters come, they're going to go collect the early ripening ones as well, and presumably the shisin as well, these ones below the branches. They at least could collect it. They might abandon it because it's like, why go collect a couple of these oddball figs growing off the branch? They may as well just be efficient and collect the great majority of them that are growing above the cluster of leaves. So Rabbi Eliezer has a good point. Why is it that you're going to say this about the early ripening figs? Because you can still collect them; they're still protected in a way. The Brisa cites an opinion that qualifies the Mishnah's ruling regarding shisin. Rabbi Yosef ben Halfusa says the shisin of Sipporin are indeed subject to the tithing obligation because they are presumed to be protected. So the Mishnah is listing shisin as one of the species exempt from Demai, and Rabbi Yosef is limiting the ruling to those that grow outside Sipporin, but the ones in Sipporin are valued. And that means that they're not leaving it over to Hefker. And Rabbi Kanievsky points out that they must be tithed in this area. Why? Because they're valuing it. They're doing like what Rabbi Eliezer is saying, where they're saying, no, this is still counted as protected, and they're still going to pick it up all in the harvest, and they're still going to use it and still going to sell it. So they're going to say that it's assumed to be protected, and you have to tithe it. Now, the Brisa is going to talk about a ruling regarding late ripening figs. This is going to be the other side. And it says, if the figs ripen late and they remained on the tree at the end of the fig harvest, but the owner is still guarding his field because of the grapes that have not yet ripened. So here's the case. Listen to this case, right? You have two crops growing there, okay? Kosher crops, not kalayim. Over here, you're going to have one crop. It's going to be figs. Let's say it's figs. And over here, you're going to have grapes, okay? Or you could also have it where it could be something else. It could be like, wheat and grapes, okay? But there's a separation, so it's not kalayim. So anyway, you have the guardsman there, and he's there to guard, in this case, the figs. And then what happens is they're finished harvesting. He's still there, but now he's just changed his attention. He's guarding the grapes, not guarding the fig trees anymore. So the question is going to be that, what's going to be the status of these late harvesting figs? Are they still going to be Hefker because the guardsman is still there or not? So in this case, the owner is guarding the grapes. He's not guarding the figs. What are you going to do about this? So the idea here says, but the owner is still guarding his field because of the grapes that have not yet ripened, or if the grapes ripen late and they remain on the vine until the end of the grape harvest. But the owner is still guarding his field because of the vegetables that have not yet ripened. Law is as follows. So you have here where maybe there's even a third field where, you have these figs that were there. You have an area now that has grapes that maybe are later in the season. And now you have some vegetables there. And he was there just guarding one of these crops, but not the other two. Or just one of these crops and not the other one in the case of just a field of two things or two fields with one watchman. What's going to be the status of these late ripening fruits? So the Gemara is going to ask and say, should a worker enter the field to tend the present crop and the owner object to his eating the late ripening figs or grapes that remained from the earlier harvest? The late ripening fruits are forbidden on account of stealing, and they should be also subject to tithing. So over here, by objecting to the worker's eating of the late ripening figs or grapes, the owner is demonstrating that he did not abandon them to Hefker. And anybody who takes it is going to be guilty of theft. Mara Fulda points out, but if the owner allows the worker to eat the late ripening fruit, he's obviously growing only the early fruit of the next harvest and has abandoned the late ripening fruit. Or in the case of watching the field, he's watching the grapes, cares about the grapes, and has changed his intention away from these figs, and basically the intentions shifted so that now you're really just concerned about the grapes and not the figs. So if somebody comes to collect the figs, that's not going to be stealing, it's just going to be taking Hefker. And there's another incident about this ruling. Ula bar Ishmael recounted the following incident in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, and it says, Rebbe and Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, entered the orchard to eat the late ripening figs of an earlier harvest, but the watchman guarding the orchard shouted at them to stop, and Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, withdrew his hand from the fruit. And Rebbe remarked to Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Yehuda, eat. Don't listen to the watchman's protest, because the owner has already despaired of harvesting the fruits, so they are Hefker. So that's actually going to be interesting, because according to Rebbe, they're assuming that the figs are Hefker, and that even if the watchman, they put away the knives, they're stopped harvesting it, maybe the watchman is now just watching these grapes over here, and it's clear that the harvest is done, the work is done, and the owner is despaired of getting, a couple of these oddball figs that are over here, and, it's going to basically be left as, leftovers, like shkichaga, right? These are gifts of, this is forgotten produce. This is where the owner has left these trees and moved on to something else. And so now if the watchman comes back to try to protest, he's not saying anything. That's Rebbe's point. And so it's unusual for somebody to take an interest in these late ripening figs, especially if the owner has moved on to other work and has left these trees. Why is it weird for the watchman to protect them because they're Hefker, or even to protest they're Hefker? So the Rabbi Yochanan is going to question Rebbe's ruling. Rabbi Yochanan asks and says, but the watchman shouted at them to stop eating the figs, and you can say that the owner abandoned the fruit to Hefker. And there's another Amara who agrees with Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yonah says Rabbi Yochanan is arguing well. He's right to say that the figs should have been forbidden. And there's a Gemara that's going to challenge Rabbi Yochanan, and the Gemara is going to continue like this. It says, but the following Mishnah, this is going to be in Maestros 3:4, says, contradicts Rabbi Yochanan, says regarding pennyroyal, hisav, and savory that are growing on their own in the courtyard, that if they were protected, they are subject to tithes. And by specifying a courtyard, the Mishnah implies that even if they were protected, they are exempt from tithing. So what do we see here? We see, says the Marafulda, that when plants of little value grow in a garden, even if the garden is protected, they are generally assumed to be Hefker. And in Rebbe's case, where you have these late ripening figs that are growing in a field, which is going to be like a vegetable garden, they should have been Hefker, as Rabbi is stating. So even though they were being protected there, they're still going to be Hefker. That's Rebbe's point. And this contradicts Rabbi Yochanan's point, who's assuming that, since they're still being protected, they're going to be forbidden. Now, the Gemara is going to defend Rabbi Yochanan and differentiate between the Mishnah's ruling about the herbs and Rebbe's ruling about these late ripening figs. And there, in the case of the herbs growing in a protected garden or field, we assume that they're Hefker, because one who wishes to take them can say to the owner, the entire world is before you. In other words, what he's saying is that these herbs are available all over the place, not just in your protected area, but you could walk 3 feet outside your protected area and get it. It's everywhere, okay? And so, if you really want these herbs, don't be unreasonable about protecting it here in a garden. It's considered Hefker, even if you dispute it, because it's just has so little value. It's always considered to be Hefker, even if it's going to be there. But here, in the case of late ripening figs, the owner of the watchman can say to the intruder that these late ripening fruits consists of a single basket full of produce, and I am saving it for my laborer to feed him when he comes back to work here. So basically they're saying that since it's reasonable to do so, the figs are not Hefker. There's a few points going on here. First of all, I want to talk about these herbs. One of the herbs there is the hisav, and the hisav in the halacha is always going to be considered to be Hefker. Why? Because that way, when the Jews are taking the hisav from all over the place in Mitzrayim to go do the Pesach, the Egyptians can't go and accuse the Jews of stealing. They can't accuse them of stealing the hisav, because it's so readily available all over the place here that even if you grew it in a protected area, you just walk, a foot over here away from the protected area, you're going to find it there too. And so it's so readily available and there's so little value to it that even if it's growing within this protected area, it's still considered Hefker, and you can't protest. In the case of Rebbe over here, this is going to be a little bit different. Rebbe, I think, is assuming that if the knives have been put away and they've moved on to other trees and they've moved on to other work, then, as we've covered in Masechet Peah, this is going to be abandoned produce. And you're allowed to come and collect it under the laws of Shkikacha, and it's a gift to the poor or to everybody. In the case of Rabbi Yochanan's pointing out and saying, wait a second, but this is still protected, and perhaps he did not abandon hope of coming to collect at least a basketful to give to his workers. So perhaps it's not Hefker, but I still agree with Rebbe on this. Rabbi Kanievsky says like this. Rabbi Kanievsky is saying, by contrast, the pennyroyal, hisav, and savory that grew on their own in the garden are inherently insignificant because these herbs are readily available everywhere and in abundance. And therefore, if the owner appoints a watchman and indicates that he does not want them to become Hefker, the attitude's unreasonable. It doesn't count. It's not like he said anything. And in this case, his intention is nullified by the attitudes of all the people, and the herbs are considered Hefker, even if he protests. That's going to be what Rabbi Kanievsky says about this. Chazan Ish has the same opinion. Now, about this is going to represent a defense of Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, and Rebbe is holding that even in the case of late ripening fruit, the owner's intention is nullified by the attitudes of all the people. And so when you're looking at all the people and they're looking at the attitudes of, trees are generally abandoned and, you've moved on. And even if you have a guy watching it, it's not enough because, it's been moved on and it falls into the laws of Hefker with the laws of shkicha and like that. Tomorrow we're going to get into the Mishnah's comments about the date palms and the novellos. Have a great day.